Welcome to Just DAO It, the podcast for people starting DAOs. I'm Adam Miller, and I'm the CEO of MyDAO, which provides legal entity solutions for DAOs, and I'm your host. Prior to starting MyDAO, I did consulting for people starting and operating DAOs. This is the first episode of Just DAO It that we are doing as a live Twitter space, and so we will see if we're actually able to take this recording and publish it to our podcast feed, hopefully so. But we'll find out soon. So let's start with a brief introduction to our guest, Cameron. Would you please tell us about yourself, how you got into Web3, and what makes you an authority on DAOs?
Awesome. Yes. Well, I'm Cameron. To introduce myself, I am lead CPA and partner at Darian Advisors, whatever you want to call it, but Darian Advisors. I've been a personal investor in crypto since 2015 and really got my first start back in 2017, 2018 with tax compliance for a few of my clients. But I would say that my real resurgence, love, and re-engagement came back during DeFi summer in 2020. I got stuck together with my good friend and now business partner, Faisal. During the worst of it, my OG badge of honor is I got the Uniswap airdrop, which is pretty cool as a CPA. I don't know many other CPAs that did participate at that point in time. So essentially, like back then, we're like, hey, there's this chaos happening in my MetaMask wallet. We're playing with all these DeFi dApps, interacting with DAOs and whatnot. If I'm confused as CPA, I'm sure 99% of my clients potentially are as well. So like, hey, there's probably something to this. Let's find some way to jam together. So we spun off our existing base from my first practice, tax practice, into Darian back in May of 2021, and haven't really looked back since. Right now, we work with over like 500 folks, a lot of DAOists, DeFi degens, DAOs, crypto adjacent businesses, validators, miners, NFT projects, the gambit. So I'd say I have been very much trial by fire for my own playing around with Web3 crypto, and then some of my best teachers are some of my clients. So in that case, I guess I can't remember what you called it first, Adam, but I am well versed in DAO life.
An authority on DAOs, which most people and say there's no such thing yet because DAOs haven't been around long enough. But I think as a result, anyone who's been doing this for at least a year really is an authority compared to the average person. So I think since you started several years ago, you certainly are.
Awesome. I'm a counselor. I'm an advisor, not an authority.
There we go. I like it. Perfect. All right. So this is the first Just DAO It where we're not following the same pattern that we used to. We used to always do the DAO news of the week, and then we would go into a structured interview with our guest. This is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be a little bit more freeform. We'll try to have a little bit more fun, and I'll also try to participate a little bit more rather than just being someone who is just asking the questions. So maybe I'll just share, briefly for the folks that are listening, what makes me so excited about DAOs. And then we'll turn to the topic. Well, maybe Cameron, we'll see if you want to add something to that. And then we'll turn to the topic of crypto taxes and DAO taxes, because I think people do want to hear about that. It's very practical. I guess, especially this time of year with taxes being due in the US pretty soon. So, I just want to share this one vision that I have for the future, which is, first, let's take a step back. If you think about some of the biggest technology innovations of the last couple of decades, a good example would be, let's say, Uber or Amazon. So when Uber was started, people looked at Uber and said, wow, if they're really, really successful, maybe they'll capture 50% of the taxi market. And what we now know is that they didn't just capture 50% of the taxi market, they changed the way people live and how they get around, such that people are using ride sharing in situations that they never would have even used a taxi before. Similar with Amazon, right? Amazon came out and people said, well, maybe they'll capture half of the bookseller market. Maybe they'll capture half of the retail market. But it's not like we all get together with our families on Sunday for 4 hours and sit around on our computer shopping instead of going to Home Depot and Costco. We shop in a totally different way today because there's so much less friction and the experience is so different. And I think we're going to see the same thing over the next 5 years with DAOs, where we're not just going to see half the time someone is going to start a traditional company, instead they'll start a DAO. We're going to see people starting structured organizations in places that we never had structured organizations before. somewhere in between individuals, families, friend groups, clubs, companies, businesses, charities, governments, international governments, right, and all the spaces in between. So today, I don't think we've seen what that really means yet, but I think over the next few years we'll find out. So Cameron, I'm just curious if you have a similar vision for the future of DAOs, or what is it that makes you so excited about DAOs?
I mean, I am a environmental at heart, so I think what first got me excited about like the DAO, and like again, I fell for the whole Klima DAO rebasing back and then the whole long story, but it comes back to the concept that I was on a chat with a colleague at the practice I was consulting with, and he was just talking about how like shrines or bodies or natural features in India, they all each had their own like governing body that was representing whatever the idea or fundraising collective for the management of it. And that kind of like tripped my brain of saying like, well, if it has legal personhood, if it can be sued in, Indian courts and saying like, whatever this construct or idea or shrine, et cetera, is, how can we not apply that to anything else? And seeing that and the ability to organize from that perspective was kind of an interesting take. And, in coming to Denver, meeting y'all and just seeing what DAOs are being used for today from either like community organization or specific ventures or with a goal or crowd Sci or DSci or all these different offshoots that couldn't be done in a traditional, 501c3 or an LLC or corp or PBC or cooperative structure. It's just a different way to get different parties involved, have their efforts, be part of whatever that overall mission of what the entity is, and have that kind of shared governance model. So it's been really interesting seeing that across the board really grow and develop. And that's kind of what really got me turned on to it. And also the concept of just having something be literally code and having people vote on what code is and having that code be the overall bylaws of whatever the structure is quite fascinating, as opposed to the more archaic, here's our quorum each quarter and we have, X amount of shareholders vote. And then we take it to the board of directors and they approve X motion. It's just a more fluid, futuristic way to not even govern businesses, but govern just organizations in general.
Awesome. I love it. Okay. I'm going to take us from high level visionary stuff right into the core topic that I think people are here to learn about, which is the most specific topic, which is taxes for DAOs. So let's start there. And then with whatever time we have left, we'll back into taxes for crypto in general, even beyond DAOs. And then if we have time, we'll back up even further from there. So let's just dive right into taxes for DAOs. And Cameron, I want to just start by giving you the chance to share, like, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you? Or let's say a DAO, someone who's part of a DAO comes to you and says, hey, we just realized we might want to think about taxes. What's up with that?
Yeah. So the first part is like, what is the legal wrapper, how that entity is viewed by some sort of body? So like by default, any DAO is a collection of individuals or walled addresses or wherever it is, but there's someone behind it. And like the in real life version of that is like if 5 people come together, they're for some sort of mission or whatever, absent of a wallet or any sort of online construct, it's a general partnership. But anything outside of that, unless it has some sort of wrapper or some sort of idea or structure, it keys back down to that idea. And what a general partnership does, and again, speaking with an American US tax bias, somewhere, functions, within UK or Canadian law, is that each person's derivative share of that entity is essentially taxed. So if they're 25% token holder of said DAO without any sort of structure, they're going to receive those profits come through and report 25% of such. And what we see in, kind of like the mutation of this is once you have a legal wrapper, apologies.
That's fun.
Yeah, that was good, right? I mean, I think it's the Dino, right? Dino PFP got me going. No, is once you have that, it allows to be like an entity apart from the individuals, and then it kind of brings that tax compliance down to individual levels. So it doesn't matter if your DAO is based in the Marshall Islands, Cayman, Switzerland. You have an unincorporated nonprofit association based in the States or a corporation. That kind of idea pushes the tax obligations to the individual member and actually what they're earning and how it's taxed at the treasury level, a different concern. But anybody that's a part of that DAO, token holder contributor is only paying tax on what they're either earning or receiving from said DAO. So taking that autonomy is a kind of has this whatever entities out there and it has lesser burden at the more like entity level. And it puts that tax obligation on when that gets realized or brought to or utilized in the real world with real people. And a lot of people like to live in this idea that DAO is just kind of like metaphysical. Yeah, it's a collection of people and there's no tax or whatever. But at the end of the day, there are humans behind that keyboard or, cell phone that are interacting that do have their share of efforts that are getting compensated or receiving tokens or whatever. And those people receive that income. So it kind of like takes away from the entity and puts on the individual at the very, very basic level.
Okay. Let me break that down and kind of play it back to you and see if I understand everything that you just said. So first of all, there's this concept of legal entities and default legal entities. And I think this default legal entity of a general partnership is really interesting because, a lot of people, when they're talking to us about legal entities in the Marshall Islands or wherever they're thinking about creating a legal entity, one of the things they're thinking about is, well, maybe we just don't want a legal entity. And one of the things I tell them is, well, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, if you don't actually register as a specific type of legal entity, there's effectively a default legal entity that governments will give you, which is this general partnership, which is certain, treatment in the eyes of the law and the eyes of tax institutions that is generally not going to be favorable for a number of different reasons. One of them is tax reasons. So that's the first thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's the part of, people have winged it in the past, they come to be, and I have to give the unfortunate part is like, if you were all part of a multi-sig and there was no sort of entity, whatever that was generated or earned from that multi-sig, if you're a third owner or a 25% owner, those funds are still on chain or living with that multi-sig by virtue of being part of that general partnership, your share pro rata or whatever your core store agreement dictates or even handshake amongst friends, you're going to be responsible tax-wise for your derivative or your share of the earnings.
Okay, so I'm going to make it really concrete for people. If you have, let's say, 10 people who are members of a DAO or a multi-sig or whatever kind of project, and that group of 10 people, the project they're working on makes $1 million in income in 2023 because it's like the latest and greatest new DeFi project or whatever. Then as a general partnership, so, an organization that has not elected to create a specific legal entity type, each of those 10 people is likely to be liable for taxes on $0.1 million or $100,000 worth of earnings. So literally the default treatment that probably applies to a lot of people from the past few years, but just hasn't been litigated yet by the IRS for people who haven't paid it. The default treatment is each of those 10 members has to pay taxes on $100,000 worth of earnings, even if they never saw a cent of that money. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So that's a good starting point. And I think a lot of the folks in the live audience, I think, do have legal entities, including with us at MyDAO. But it's good to set the foundation of what happens if you don't actually create a legal entity of your own. So now let's turn to the situation for people who have created a legal entity. So, I think we all probably know that there are all kinds of different legal entity types all over the world. Each jurisdiction is a little bit different. An LLC in one place is not exactly the same as an LLC somewhere else. Same things goes for corporate structures and foundations. So maybe you could start by helping us understand, how might the taxes be different depending on what type of legal entity you've created?
That's a good one. So to even get a little more basic with this, and I've worked with small business owners, startups, and just like freelancers and solopreneurs, and even just a bunch of DAOs, is if you are engaging as an individual, so like Cameron the person, I'm doing business as Cameron the person, there's not a lot I can do as a tax advisor because there's no different legal entity. But once you create Cameron the LLC or Cameron Inc. or Cameron whatever that be, it changes the conversation to the different flavors that can be taxed and it gives you an option to pull. So similar to what you touched on, Adam, is all these different flavors, and we can kind of go through with different examples. The first one is like the Wyoming DAO LLC. Really what that is it's a legal entity in Wyoming, but it's still an LLC. And then what you have to be taxed as at the IRS level is that LLC can be taxed as a corporation. It can be taxed as a partnership. It can be taxed as an S corporation. And if you get lucky on, filing your documents to the IRS, you could be even a nonprofit LLC in the proper way. And the what all those do though is, by general partnership, LLC partnership, going to be taxed the same. No real difference. You just have a legal wrap for what you're doing, which is I'm not barred in the state of California, so I'll let other people have that conversation, but you'll be taxed the same legally, whole different conversation. But going to like having your LLC or even just having a corporate, DAO based in the States is you're going to pay a flat 21% corporate income tax. And then anything that's potentially distributed to shareholders or token holders or DAO members at that point at the US level, will either be subject to dividends tax or if they're, receiving compensation, ordinary income tax and those amounts. And that's within the context within the US regimes. Now, say, for example, that DAO decides to, get its legal wrapper offshore. And, there's quite a few different, jurisdictions for this. They have all or less the same aim is take that out of the scope of, essentially US income tax and tax on residual profits. And what's beautiful about that is all these things are kind of sitting out there either on chain or not being utilized or spent. It essentially delegates the tax reporting to whatever's being paid to the individual people. So it separates this, DAO treasury overall structure from the people actually earning funds. And from what's cool from the tax perspective about that is, depending on what jurisdiction you may owe gross receipts tax or potential licensing fees or assets tax or et cetera. But it really puts that end tax reporting on the people actually getting paid for the services and not on like the capital appreciation or every single movement the DAO treasury does. I don't want to get too real, so I'll pause there and go back to you, Adam. And if we can check out different pieces. Yeah.
That sounds good. Yeah. One question about that, just to clarify. So if a DAO does have a registered legal entity that pays its own taxes, then the individuals will only pay taxes when they actually receive a distribution or a payment for services or a payment for employment or something, right?
Exactly. If your tax is like a corporate structure, if it's still in like as a corporate tax to corporation, but if you're like a DAO LLC based in Wyoming, unless you decide to go a different flavor from the tax perspective, so to speak, you're still going to be taxed as a partner within that within that partnership. And some of your examples, like if there's 10 people that form a Wyoming DAO LLC, if they don't elect any sort of tax treatment here in the States, they're still going to be on the hook for 10% of that $1 million, whether it was wrapped in a legal wrapper, which is the Wyoming DAO LLC, or just a general partnership.
Okay, so you have to elect to be taxed as a corporation, whether you're an LLC or otherwise some kind of legal entity, and then you have the benefit that because I think what's really common in DAOs is a lot of the people in the DAO are not getting paid, right? At least today, and I mean especially maybe the core team and other contributors, but a lot of DAOs have thousands or tens of thousands of people that are members, but they're just not going to get paid, and so. In all of those cases, it probably makes sense to create a legal entity and then choose to be taxed as a corporation. I mean, I shouldn't say in all those cases because it really does depend. And obviously, one of the reasons that we're bringing Cameron here today is that as much advice as he can give in an hour, you'll need more if you're actually trying to pay your DAO's taxes in any kind of complex scenario. But that said, I guess generally speaking, that's the idea. But behind a corporate tax election is that the people involved will not get taxed unless they're actually receiving some kind of payment or distribution. Generally, is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. If you think about what the corporation tax is like it's kind of like a deferment strategy where it doesn't really tax individual members. Each person is on the hook for it. You're not paying quote unquote like phantom income tax on profits you're never actually realizing until you actually get paid from said DAO or corporation. You just pay whatever the percentage is in X jurisdiction. It sets it aside. And then whenever people do pay that to the individual, then they pay their taxes there. But you're still paying corporate tax, which is, a discussion.
Yeah. So, a lot of DAOs are nonprofits or think of themselves as being charitable. What's different in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, and I've seen this even with, a few, regenerative projects I work with, and it's not hard in the States. If you form a nonprofit corporation, and then go file your 1023 with the IRS, as long as your DAO has an altruistic or public servicing or some sort of benefit to society, and, incorporates a nonprofit, probably isn't the worst thing to even do to onshore. I mean, there is like the legal ramifications of being within the states. But, as long as it is towards the public good, that solves the problem of not being a little partnership, no corporate tax, and that DAO can raise funds, build the treasury, make grants, do all these things in the spirit of nonprofit activities. But it's when, yeah, I'll stop there. But yeah, it's essentially, it's if you have some sort of good to contribute to society, or you're, in the case of like, I'm a CPA. If we want to go out and form a DAO to put together a library of free text resources, as long as it's in the spirit of public good or service to society, there's no harm in, applying for the 1023, raising funds, doing so through a tax-free vehicle, which is a nonprofit, and then, achieving those aims onshore.
And generally is the same true for non-US based nonprofits, whether it's a foundation or in Switzerland or the Cayman Islands or a nonprofit in the Marshall Islands or whatever it is?
Exactly. It's the same kind of idea, is that the entity itself, and depending on what qualifies as a nonprofit or foundation or tax eligible structures, like you're not paying tax as long as you satisfy the legal requirements to be that entity in said jurisdiction. But if someone, say you're an executive director of a nonprofit, working, getting paid your salary or your contractor fees, et cetera, from a nonprofit in the States, yeah, you're going to pay tax on it. Just like if you were, contributing services to a DAO based in, Switzerland, or a foundation, Cayman Islands or BVI, et cetera, you're still going to be taxed on your actual service to labor contributor that you get paid for and compensated for.
Yep. Okay. Makes sense. So one of the interesting things that comes up when I'm talking to people that have a DAO, they're thinking about registering it as a nonprofit, is oftentimes there's a project. It has multiple legal entities. It has multiple smart contracts involved. And people may be making money off of that system in some way, right? Maybe it's a token that's rising in value. Maybe it's that they're a liquidity provider in the protocol and they're a member of the DAO. And there's this metaphor I heard from a lawyer that I want to run by you that I share with a lot of prospects and clients that we think helps people see the flexibility of nonprofits. And the metaphor is the following. So there's a couple examples. One is professional sports associations like the NHL and NBA or the MLB, which are nonprofits. And yet it's a scenario where people make tons of money off of the activity, right? The teams that are members of that nonprofit association are incredibly for-profit. And the team absolutely rise and fall in value, as is their stock. And yet there's no question about whether like these sports leagues should be considered nonprofits or not. One more example is a yacht club. So yacht clubs and a lot of other clubs and associations tend to be nonprofits, and even can be governed by the members in some cases. And yet the yachts can rise and fall in value. Your membership could be, worth a lot. And there could even be services provided by the club that help you maintain or increase the value of your yacht. And so in both of these cases, I don't think almost anyone would question whether these, should be nonprofits or not. And it sounds similar to, the situation where there's a DeFi protocol and the DAO maybe supports the protocol, governs the protocol. A lot of the people are involved with the protocol, but the DAO is not the protocol. And so it often seems like a nonprofit could be a good fit. So what are your thoughts on these metaphors and how they apply to considering an organization as a nonprofit or not?
No, I think those are excellent metaphors. And the fact that like they are adjacent to the profit activities, but kind of like going back towards that, if like, here's the development entity that's actually responsible for creating the value, or actually is providing services, or is the business of making profits to then pay to the contracts people service it. But then there's also people who are just in charge of overall governance or the overall direction or whatnot. And I think that's a great example. The MLB, NHL, it's really funny. I actually think those were actually nonprofit foundations. But the same idea too is that there's also private foundations where like, hey, I'm Cameron, I want to start, Cameron's foundation. And as long as the aims of what I'm doing isn't just to go make crazy amounts of money and then safeguard this, but it's what you do with said money at that point. So if it's, create awareness or doing X or furthering X mission, apart from just the point of just like making a bunch of money to sell to somebody else, it's the idea of what a nonprofit is that it exists outside of the individual stakeholders. It's something that's supposed to exist more in kind of perpetuity. So going back to the NHL MLB example is like the NHL MLB exists to further the perpetuity of professional sports in the United States. Now, each individual party is going to make money furthering that mission, hiring players and creating value and generating ticket sales and then distribute to said owners. But the MLB itself just exists to
yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I also wonder about, I don't know if they call it an edge case, but let's say, for example, that I start a nonprofit. Let's say it's a DAO, and it's a nonprofit foundation or nonprofit LLC or whatever. And my purpose is to support Cameron in his life. And I go and I raise money from people, and then all the money we get, we give it to Cameron. I think that actually would be okay, right? I mean, it sounds like it's similar to picking an area. Let's say like South Central LA, which is somewhat near where I live, and I want to start a nonprofit that benefits people in South Central LA. So we're going to raise a bunch of money and we're going to give it to those people. So that's the first scenario. But the second scenario is, now what about when those people are involved in the governance? It seems to me that if the people of South Central LA want to govern the nonprofit that benefits those people, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't think there would be an issue with that. At the same time, if Cameron is on the board of the nonprofit whose purpose is to give Cameron money, I think there maybe would be an issue. So how do you think about that type of, because again, I think it's similar to DAO use cases, right? Where the DAO's purpose is to support a certain community, but then those people in the community are also the token holders. And so is that okay? And how do you think about that?
I mean, as far as benefiting myself, so there's like the opposite part of like be on the board and then being a direct beneficiary. That probably would be some sort of taxable, benefit. I got to be taxed on those benefits. But in the case of like benefit overall community, project, idea, mission, structure, whatever that be, and having people that represent that or are directly involved and have them be on the governance board is completely fine. And then also be in some sort of way, like either not direct or maybe indirect beneficiaries of those movements. But then if, for example, like using your South Central LA, I'm on that board and I'm getting paid to do the books or the tax return or even just marketing for that, like that's a service. And that's like directly to the individual. And that's obviously taxed for the individual providing services. But the overall, like raising funds and then putting that back to community, or we do a garden or a community garden, or we're fixing this or advocating this or certain rights at, city council, etc. Those would be nonprofit activities and be okay if I'm a member of that community, helping govern that organization, raising funds and spending said funds, as long as it's for a mission apart from just like paying myself, Cameron. So I would say if there's 2 or 3 parties, sure, like, like a GoFundMe example, that would be taxable, which is kind of weird. But it's sort of like an overall, funding some sort of mission, structure, event, community, multiple parties. It's a perfect example.
And then I guess someone's still paying taxes, right? I mean, if I raise $1 million and then we pay someone to do something in South Central LA, that person has to recognize that as revenue on, whatever business it is that we're hiring. And so they'll end up paying taxes on that revenue or those earnings. Or if we're just giving money to all the Camerons of LA, then they're going to have to pay taxes on the money we give them. So it's not like the IRS isn't getting anything out of the situation.
No, I mean, exactly. I mean, like, kind of take that example is like we start the Sports South Central LA. We decide to make a grant of $10,000 to start a community garden. That $10,000 is going to be spent towards the fence builder, the equipment, the dirt, etc. And those people, those contractors, or anybody that's actually helping develop that plot or community garden, they're going to pay income tax on wherever they get paid from their share. So at the end of the day, yes, someone is going to pay tax on it. It's just a matter of, is it at that moment or is it get delayed? And that's the whole point of that. The DAO of itself or a nonprofit structure is it just delays the tax in essence. But at the end of the day, someone's going to pay tax on their perceived benefit from, or even just compensation from that entity or structure.
Cool. Awesome. By the way, I think South Central LA is probably a nice place these days. It's just an example I use because when I was growing up, people always talked about Compton and South Central LA and stuff. Um, okay, so we've talked about for-profits and nonprofits. Let's talk about the foreign nature or the global nature of a lot of DAOs and their legal entities. So, to me, one of the really interesting things about DAOs that tends to be different from other companies is that they're global from the start. And that might be because they actually have 10 or 20 or 100 or 1,000 people from all over the world already in a Discord server or wherever collaborating to do something together. But it could also just be, let's say, Jana and I get together and we want to start a DAO, and we have started DAOs together. Let's say we want to start a DAO. And even though we actually are right now, I think, both in California, but like from the beginning, we know it's going to be global, right? The purpose of the DAO is that people from all over the world participating and governing and everything. So, I think many DAOs, right? You have exceptions like the Austin, Texas DAO, which is a cool DAO, all about Austin. There's Miami Community Radio, there's others. But for most DAOs, they want to be global. And so right out of the gate, there's this question of, well, if we're global, where do we want to choose to create our legal entity? Classically, if we were starting a business, we probably would have just said, well, let's just do a California entity or a Delaware entity, and then we'll figure out the rest as we go. But I think it's different now. And so, what does this global marketplace look like from your perspective in terms of kind of choosing a jurisdiction? And then also, what are the implications for the fact that most of the members, almost by definition, are not going to live in the same jurisdiction where the DAO has formed its legal entity?
States. So it's easy for DAOs to form offshore. And especially if you're living on chain, it's a lot easier because you don't need to get a bank account. And for us, where it gets complicated, it's like we have to be registered with the IRS. We have to have liability insurance. We got to be able to transmit and receive funds, etc. But if you don't need that structure, foreign offshore is actually quite easy because it removes that burden of anybody that's participating. If I'm an American, I'm in a UK limited company. Like, do I need to file UK taxes with the HMRC? But if I'm part of a DAO that's now based offshore, yes, the treasury, the entity itself has its own obligations, its own filing, but I'm only responsible for what I get paid from that, that DAO or structure later on as an individual. I'm not responsible for whatever happens in the standpoint. So starting from from day one, make things a lot easier for people that are participants. Because if you don't, and we've went through this, even both you and I are with my DAO and Adam and whatnot, and even some other parties, is they form a C Corp or LLC here in the States. They're looking to raise funds or generate capital, get access to a bank account, etc. They create this thing of value, this token, they launch it, and then they want to cede control to the DAO that's offshore at a later date. And once you start onshore, you're essentially selling something of value to something that's offshore that could be governed by a Cayman foundation, but you're going to have a pretty big tax event for anybody involved at that point in time. So if that IP is created in a more tax advantage or even just like friendly jurisdictional vehicle, it just alleviates that concern for people that, and it potentially reduces that U.S. tax exposure. Anybody that's obviously working and living in the States or in any sort of jurisdiction is going to pay their own taxes, but it pushes that burden to whoever's providing the services, wherever they're living, and it's paid in those jurisdictions as opposed to folks at the entity level. That was very long-winded, and I apologize.
No, it's okay. It gets complicated very, very quickly, very easily. So
it's like figure tangent.
Right, exactly. I want to see if I caught the gist of what you were just sharing. So I think you were saying that generally speaking, being a part owner or member in a foreign, I don't know if you said corporation or a foreign company, there's not usually going to be a pass-through tax. It's usually like just because you're a member, it's always going to be only money that organization actually pays to you that you have to pay taxes on.
Generally, if I'm a member of like this foreign DAO or UAE corporation, et cetera, it's going to be whatever your deriving profits or actual payments from that. But if I'm, a member of a DAO or corporation based in the States, I'm going to be potentially responsible for tax filings, obligations, trade, like effectively connected income with the United States trade or business. So if you have a multi-jurisdictional team, if you do form here, it's not terrible, right? But like it just makes the conversation a little bit tougher, and it like the compliance a little bit more structured. And if you don't need to sometimes, or if most of your team's offshore, if you don't need to raise funds or register with the SEC, et cetera, and most of your things are being conducted on chain, starting offshore may be a better approach just to reduce that, initial burden, especially for smaller DAOs that can't afford to do all the crazy foreign partnership, compliance that may be required in a certain jurisdiction.
Okay, so you're saying that this extra kind of burden falls on people who are members of a foreign company?
Are not. So it's if you're if like, okay, so let's take this, like, sorry to get winded, but like to take this with a very simple example, it's like I have my LLC partnership based in the States, or my DAO based in the States, right? I've got myself, I've got one partner that's based in Canada, one based in the UK. Now, say we only generate, $5,000 of taxable income. Now, to maintain compliance with that $5,000 taxable income for those foreign partners, we've got to file withholding tax. So like potentially 19 to 37% just gets taken and then sent to the IRS. Then that party, so the Canadian or the UK citizen, has to file a foreign non-resident return to get that refund back and basically say, well, I wasn't actually here at this time, or I've already paid UK Canadian tax against it. So for a very small organization to maintain compliance, and like that's a very complex tax return to file. And it's why you see a lot of, startups just form Delaware C Corp, because it just takes that out, even if you have foreign parties. But then when you try to unwind it or move offshore or go to a DAO structure, there is a taxable event because that onshore structure has created value, that it's selling said value to the third party. But if you're in some sort of structure like that, where that doesn't have the same kind of ruling or requirements for foreign token holders, foreign DAO members, it reduces that burden for smaller entities.
So I think you've just addressed one of the things we often tell people is that we hear that people outside the United States are less likely to want to be a member or owner of a US-based corporate entity. And I think you've just identified one, or maybe the major reason for that, which is, and I didn't know that there was automatic withholding of income for foreign people until they file. I thought they just had to file a document with the IRS that no one wants to do. But now I can see, if I'm understanding you correctly, a reason why a lot of DAOs go outside the United States, at least have one entity outside the United States, which is their foreign persons are more likely to participate.
That's exactly it. Or you pay a nice, 21% corporate tax for the not have to deal with my withholding. But then if you do any dividends or any sort of like profit sharing structures, you still fall in the same problem. So it's difficult to be a foreign shareholder partner unless you're a very well capitalized DAO startup partnership, that you can pay those, and deal with the chaos of compliance and waiting for refunds and filing. But that's also like hard for, the common man, which is, most people involved in DAOs.
Yeah. What about the reverse scenario? So, and this is especially relevant for us at my DAO. What about when an American, or if you can speak to it, a European or whoever else, is a member of a entity in the Marshall Islands? I know that there's no filing requirements for them with the Marshall Islands, but do their home jurisdictions like the IRS require them to do or pay anything because of their ownership or membership in a foreign company?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you're in that case of like, I'm an American and I am a holder of this like Marshall Islands DAO LLC or whatever that is at that point. Now, all I'm going to be taxed on is anything that comes back in. So if I get paid out profits, or if I get paid out for services, I'm only going to pay tax on that when I actually receive it, when it's actually earned and realized here in the States. And then anything outside of that would just be potentially any FinCEN or AppBar reporting. So if you have, greater than 10 grand or derivative share or any, that's more of a compliance item or a treasury item. But from the tax perspective, it's only when you actually receive payment or earn monies from said overseas corporation.
Okay.
Unless it's greater than 50% American owned, which then could be potentially viewed as a controlled foreign corporation, which is another discussion for another day. We can also dive into it, but that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, and it's true about that. Okay, so as long as it's less than half owned by Americans, then it's not going to be treated as a foreign controlled corporation. What about when it's not a corporation? What about when it's an LLC? Is it the same? I mean, let's just talk about the DAO LLC for a second. It's a for-profit. Well, there's a nonprofit and a for-profit, but let's talk about the for-profit because that's where taxes get into play. It's a for-profit LLC called a DAO LLC in the Marshall Islands. It's taxed at a 3% gross revenue tax from the Marshall Islands. So not including dividends and capital gains, but including all of the revenue, they have to pay a tax on that. Now, what about for the foreign owner member of one of those LLCs?
Potentially could have, exposure is, like I said, if it's greater than 50% owned, it could be deemed to be that, and then would need to file a 1120, I can't remember the exact name, it's 1120F, which is a foreign corporation return in the States, which then for anything that's deemed effectively connected with a U.S. trade or business. So if someone's, selling or engaging with U.S. customers or providing services in the States, that could be deemed to be effectively connected with the U.S. states or the U.S. trade or business. But if you're an American, say you're living in Australia, before Marshall Islands down, and you're not selling of any services to American customers or engaging with everybody in like Japan, for example, you may not have any U.S. income tax liability. You may need to file a return, potentially depending upon how the CFC rules work. But as long as you're not generating profits from U.S. customers, you may be okay from that perspective. So it really just depends on where those amounts and where those monies are actually being earned from or how they're being earned. And this is where it kind of even gets more complex. It's like, it's a wallet address, right? Or wherever those things, it's like, how can you actually deem us to be, an American, which is, it's a can of worms. We got a lot of fun cut out for us in the next couple of years.
Yeah, so speaking of it getting complicated, I want to invite Jana to ask you a question or two because I know she deals with lawyers, tax advisors, and DAOs all the time and is aware of some of the more complicated questions we get asked. So, Jana, what's on your mind?
Yeah, thanks, guys. This is a really thought-provoking discussion, and I originally had a question about staking and how that was treated, but I think I'm just going to back it up and say I speak to probably anywhere from 30 to 60 DAOs a week that are looking to incorporate. Yeah, and so they ask some really great questions. And one question that I'm wondering if they should be asking that they're not is, should people, as they get involved in DAOs, I mean, a lot of this stuff is, I don't want to say shrouded in secrecy because I don't want to use that word, but sometimes it's difficult to find out what the legal structure of a DAO is, right? Like, I'm a member of Bankless DAO, for example. There's like over 1,000 people, and most people don't even know who to go to ask a specific question, right? So we do a lot of chatting through DMs and things like that. And so I'm wondering, when you talk about these taxes here and the DAO's legal structure, I mean, should members or contributors be asking as they join so that they know what they're getting into? Like, especially Americans, right? We have this burden, no matter where we live and no matter where we place our seat in the world, that we have a obligation for worldwide income tax. It doesn't matter if we never live here again, unless we like relinquish our citizenship and do all kinds of complicated things. I mean, we have that burden. So I'm just wondering, like, are these the types of questions that people should be asking sort of like out of the gate as they get involved in a DAO? Like, where would say, entity and what would my responsibility be?
I mean, potentially, yeah. It also depends on, how big they're involved or to what degree, or if they receive tokens, et cetera, the potential obligations. But a lot of, if you're, just a DAO, not just, but just say you're a DAO contributor, a member, a token holder, most of your obligations or concerns, if you're, a minority, quote unquote, like a minority token holder, is not really personal, right? Like, you're more responsible for if you're receiving staking rewards, or if you're farming the native, governance token and an LP, et cetera, or if you're receiving capital gains, like that's really much individualized. Or if you're getting paid in that token for your services, that's also individualized. But the conversation of like, it's the upside of whatever that DAO structure is. And if you are potentially a shareholder, or, you actually have equity, or if that DAO is inevitably sold to another party, and not like through a foundational nonprofit structure, potentially, yeah, like having that question be a very, very good conversation of, what is it and what am I actually signing up for when I receive it? Not probably a big deal if you're like buying a governance token on Uniswap, but if you are participating more in the governance, or if you are a larger stakeholder or one of the core contributors, definitely ask the question.
That's a really good point. I will be sure to pass that along. And then my other question, if we have time, is just how is staking treated from a tax standpoint? I mean, it's kind of a loaded question, right? But if I talk to a lot of DeFi protocols that the protocol is not legally wrapped, right? Because it's open source and it's its own unique, or it's its own object, if you will. And then you have the DAO that manages the treasury and the governance, et cetera. And they give out staking rewards and things of that nature. How should something like that be considered if you're a serious contributor in a DAO? And if this is like now borderline tax advice, then I guess we can table it as that.
No, we just say the magic words, which is not tax advice, and do your own research. We're good. We can say whatever we want. But no, I will say, but I will say is from the individual standpoint, and this is something we live with a lot, and it's also very important because anybody that's part of a DAO is probably going to see either delegate or stake their token with the DAO for the spirit of the treasury, so they can generate and keep doing whatever the DAO needs to do, and for that you're receiving rewards. Now, whether staking is taxable or not is going to be argued until we're all blue in the face for the next 3 to 5 years. And the conservative, like CPA answer, and what the current IRS guidance says, is if you receive something of value, when it comes into your wallet, it's generally considered to be income. So you claim those rewards, they come into your wallet, those are going to be income, and that's what the IRS is going to argue. And a lot of also this with the CRA is like, the HMRC, the ATO, when you receive it, generally going to be received as ordinary income. Now, where I see this as someone that's been staking or participating, in the different types of staking or even yield farming, the true answer is it depends. And where I kind of walk this through, and there's a couple of a few other people in the space that will take the IRS guidance and just iterate it, which is the more conservative defensible position. And I get it. And it's a part of this is all going to be argued in tax courts. But conferring with our, partner tax attorneys who have successfully, one case is arguing that mining itself is non-taxable until they actually sell the tokens. In mining, we thought when Bitcoin first came out, the IRS would say mining rewards or art forks are taxable. If we're still getting questions in tax courts about that, that means staking, yield farming, LP rewards, all these other items. The short answer is it depends. And it's probably until we get something passed by Congress. Everything right now for the IRS is FAQs, bulletins, advice, which means if we audit your tax return and if this goes to tax courts, this is our position and you knew better and you're directly going against it. It doesn't mean that the position that staking is not taxable is wrong, but it's going to be an argument which is going to take legal resources to get across that finish line. And the kind of highlight staking in general, and where it's quite frustrating as a tax CPA, because I get this question asked all the time, and I wish I could give a better answer. But the thing is if you think about the various steps, is say you're staking with Algorand or Tezos, where you receive your rewards every single, block or Epic, etc. And those come into your wallet. And then you restake those, you never sell them for fiat, you never sell them for stables, you never remove them off, you never get anything of value of it. The IRS had a case, which is the Jarrett case. They dismissed it, they paid a refund, and basically we'll fight this for another day. Now, what happens when you delegate? Or you have an auto, you have a Combat, a liquid staking, all these derivatives where generally we see them as potentially capital gains events because you're not actually directly receiving that token. So if you get offered there's liquid staking on, I'm a big part of the Cosmos IBC community. There's liquid staking or, delegations and auto delegations. Like, if you don't physically receive those into your wallet, the actual claim event, it strengthens the case that it's not ordinary income. So how you're staking, there's no wrong or right answer, but there's better ways to make it defensible if things go the wrong way or if things do get auto changed. So the literally very short answer is it depends. We have a lot of clients on the individual side that will kind of push it. Also some that are more by the book, but that's where we work with to understand where the risk preference is, what the type of staking is, how you're staking and through what fashion. But I do see on the more enterprise level, some of our validators, people are natively with, a little bit more directly involved just because they have a little bit more legal exposure, compliance exposure. They tend to err on the side of conservatism and pay tax on their staking rewards just because if things went the other way, they could be made an example of in the IRS tax court. So really, really pick your poison. I make DMs are open, ask me questions on this for specific examples, etc. But personally, as who Cameron is and what I file my own taxes, I generally, for most of my stake rewards, I push to capital gains. I think it's a fair argument to be had. But it's one of those things where going back to my clients, I'm like, well, how much do you want to sleep at night? No, if you challenge the IRS.
Yeah. No, it's a good point, and it's fascinating. And I should mention, I'm not even sure if I told you this. I actually met someone at Eat Denver that was from the IRS, or they said they were from the IRS, and I was impressed, but also,
yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I want to dig one question deeper into the staking question, and then I know we're almost out of time. What about from not the person receiving the staking rewards perspective, but from the let's say it's a DAO LLC or some kind of DAO corporate entity that either a protocol they govern is providing rewards or the DAO itself is providing staking rewards from its treasury. How do you think about that from a tax perspective?
From that level, I would say the short answer is depends, right? I'm going to cop out. No, but if it is a for-profit structure where if a token holder has rights to the equity or upside, if you're accruing more or granting them more, it'd be more akin to an analogous example is a stock split or stock dividend, which wouldn't really be a deduction to the corporation of sorts. And then if you have a nonprofit where you're granting more, if you're making these more available and issuing more staking rewards, those would be, a non-deductible expense because it's not tax, or sorry, deductible, not deductible, but just an expense to the overall nonprofit. So I don't think if you're in the for-profit sphere that these would be deductible, but that's the flip side is if the IRS deems and this later gets hauled up in tax courts or approved in tax courts 2-3 years down the road, if it's income to the individual, right? If I have to make a nice income every time I receive a staking reward, the flip side of that is then that's the expense to the issuing entity, which would then be deductible. So it depends on which thing it goes, but the thing is you also have a timing difference where one person may deem it's expense or it's stock split or it's non-taxable, and the other one isn't. And that's you have two things that mesh here, comparing apples to oranges, what both flip sides both sides of the transaction are.
No, that's great. That's great. And I think I will bring us to a close, at least from the podcast perspective, and then we can talk about whether we have a few extra minutes to hang out and invite people on stage. But for the podcast's sake, Cameron, first of all, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. It's the deepest we've ever gone in a Just DAO It, and I'm excited for future episodes now as a result. Where can people find you and Darian Advisors on the web and or on social?
Yeah. So Telegram and Twitter, Cameron_Darian. Our website is www.darien, DARIEN, advisors.io. And we offer for anybody a free 20-minute introductory call center to what your situation, what's about, and then we kind of take it from there. So hit us up. If you're looking to collab or partnership, reach out to me directly. I'm always wanting to have fun conversations. I spend a lot of time in the tax weeds, so anything that's not tax, I will happily chat with you guys about.
Awesome. Love it. And you can find me on Twitter at 0xthriller. MyDAO is at MyDAODS. That's MIDAODS on Twitter or MyDAO.org. And you can find our co-host Jana at Jana_Standis on Twitter. And Cameron, thank you so much again. And for the audience, live audience, as well as the podcast audience, are you thinking about starting a DAO? Just DAO it. Just DAO It is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Just DAO It does not contain any legal or financial advice. My DAO also does not provide legal or financial advice, and nor does your host, yours truly.